This is the third session of the Sheltered Instruction training. In this session, we're going to learn about and discuss the first component of SIOP, which is lesson preparation. We'll view 2 videos on lesson preparation, discuss content objectives and language objectives, and we'll discuss what should be done before the lesson. Let's begin by watching parts 1A and 1B of the training.
In today's session, we will talk about the component lesson preparation of the SIOP model. This video is part 1 of 2. Today's topic, objectives. Let's take a look at those 8 SIOP components. They consist of lesson preparation, building background, comprehensible input, strategies, interaction, practice and application, lesson delivery, and review and assessment. Lesson preparation has 6 features. Today we will discuss the first 2. Those features are content objectives and language objectives are clearly defined, displayed, and reviewed with the students. Our content objectives for today are to identify the first 2 features in the lesson preparation component, and differentiate between a content objective and a language objective. Our language objectives are to discuss content and language objectives that can be applied to the classroom, read examples of current content and language objectives, and finally, to use features of WIDA and new academic standards to write content and language objectives that will be applied in the classroom. Learning objectives are essential, both content and language. The target visual is perfect for symbolizing content and language objectives. If we blindfold our students by keeping the purpose of the lesson hidden, they will have a difficult time hitting the target or goal of the lesson. By sharing the objectives, we remove obstacles and allow students to easily see where we need them to go. Objectives guide both your teaching and learning in the classroom. They are the foundation of your lesson. In SIOP classrooms, you will see both content and language learning goals. They should be written in kid-friendly language, posted and reviewed with students. Attainment of these objectives should be assessed and reviewed with the students at the end of the lesson. Content objectives describe what needs to be learned in regards to the content. They should be developed from the state standards and the curriculum. And they should be written at the lesson level and should be taught and learned in 1 or 2 lessons. Most of us learn the importance of writing and teaching to content objectives early in our professional preparation. However, it is often easy to overlook sharing the objectives orally and in writing with our students. SIOP teachers not only post objectives and read them aloud at the beginning of the lesson, but they also review and evaluate as a group whether or not the objectives were met that day or by the end of the lesson. On the next few slides, we're going to take a look at different grade level academic standards and what an example content objective would look like. So for this example, let's take a look at grade 1. I'm going to look at 1RL32. Identify who is telling the story at various points in a text. That is the Indiana Academic Standard. Now, how do I take that language and make it kid-friendly for my students? My objective might look something like this. I will be able to identify who is telling the story. Let's take a look at a 6th grade math example. I'm going to look at Standard 6C2, compute with positive fractions and positive decimals fluently using a standard algorithmic approach. My example content objective might look like this. I will be able to solve problems with positive fractions and decimals using the standard method. In 8th grade science might look like this. 841, understand how the strength of attractive forces among particles in a material helps to explain many physical properties of the material, such as why different materials exist as gases, liquids, or solids at a given temperature. This standard is a bit lengthy, so we could split this up into two different content standards. My examples look like this. I will be able to analyze the strength of attractive forces among particles and materials, and I will also be able to draw conclusions about materials' physical properties. Finally, let's take a look at a high school government standard, USG 42. Describe how different governments interact in world affairs. My example content objective, I will be able to identify how different governments interact in world affairs. Commonly used verbs for content objectives might include identify, solve, investigate, distinguish, hypothesize, create, select, draw conclusions, and analyze. Let's take a look at feature 2, language objectives. The reason for having a language objective is to support students' academic language development. Language objectives are simply about which domain of language you would target with your students: listening, reading, speaking, or writing. Language objectives describe how the students will demonstrate their knowledge of content concept through reading, writing, listening, and speaking. They build students' academic language proficiency in each subject area. Again, they should be written at the lesson level and should be taught and learned in 1 or 2 lessons. Language objectives may focus on developing academic vocabulary, phonemic awareness, reading comprehension skills, a student's ability to brainstorm, draft, revise, and edit a text, and functional language such as presenting opinions, requesting information, negotiating meaning, providing detailed explanations. They may also focus on developing higher order thinking skills, such as articulating predictions, stating conclusions, summarizing information, and making comparisons. Language objectives also can focus on the knowledge of specific grammar points, such as capitalization, pronoun usage, past or future verb tenses. And language objectives also focus on knowledge of English language structures, such as questioning patterns, sentence formation, and comparative phrases. So how can I make language objectives student-friendly? Teachers of younger students may even want to consider further adapting the objectives. Kindergarten teachers may use symbols, such as a pencil to symbolize writing, and a mouth to symbolize talking when they post their objectives for their children to see. Teachers of young learners also use pictures to show the key terms they want their students to use, or to convey the topic of the lesson. Some examples are a picture of a ruler and of hands to discuss standard and non-standard measurement. One way that teachers can ensure that their language objectives are measurable and student-friendly is by using appropriate verbs, such as list, retell, summarize in writing, record, read, describe, orally explain, and report findings in writing. It is also important to not equate low language proficiency with limited cognitive ability. Therefore, you will want to make sure that the language objectives you create also reflect tasks that fall on the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy, and use verbs accordingly. Since acquiring language is a process, your language objectives may range from process-oriented to performance-oriented statements. This ensures that students will have an opportunity to explore and practice an objective before demonstrating their mastery of it. Some process examples are exploring, participating in small group listening, reading for information. This is where they will use the receptive language skills, such as listening and reading. But for performance-oriented, they'll be using output language, such as writing or speaking. They might do activities that ask them to draft or edit, to write, participate in small groups by stating their opinions, thoughts, or questions, or presenting orally. Here is a progression of process to performance objectives that might be taught over a week. Day 1, students recognize similes in a text, so they read for similes. Day 2, they discuss the functions of similes, so speaking with a partner. Day 3, they write similes. And Day 4, they write a paragraph that describes the setting using similes. So in the next few slides, let's take a look at some example language objectives. If you remember in the earlier slides, we looked at a grade level 1 standard. Standard 1 RL32. Identify who is telling the story at various points in a text. Our example content objective was I will be able to identify who is telling the story. What would language objectives look like for this lesson? I will listen to a story. I will orally describe who is telling the story and how I know. I will read a familiar story, and I will summarize in writing who is telling the story and how I know. If you look at the example language activities, we've listed listening, speaking, reading, and writing all in one lesson. Let's take a look at grade 6 again. 6C2, compute with positive fractions and positive decimals. Our content objective was to solve problems with positive fractions and decimals using the standard method. My language objectives might be, I will read the steps of the standard method and I will explain how I solved the problem. For this lesson, we use reading and speaking. Grade 8, Science Standard 841. Understand how the strength of attractive forces among particles in a material helps to explain many physical properties. My example content objective was, I will be able to analyze the strength of attractive forces among particles in materials, and I will be able to draw conclusions about materials' physical properties. Let's take a look at what the language objectives might look like. I will read and list the attractive forces in a material. I will list the physical properties of a material. I will share my conclusions as to why different materials exist as gases, liquids, or solids at different temperatures, and I will test my conclusions. So you can see in my language objectives, I used read, write, speak, listen. Let's take a look at that high school standard, USG 42. I will describe how different governments interact in world affairs. Our content objective, I will be able to identify how different governments interact in world affairs. Our language objectives might look like this. I will listen to a video about different government interactions. I will discuss connections to real-world examples. I will summarize how different governments reacted to a single event, and I will orally summarize likes and differences of governments. In this lesson, we've used listening, speaking, writing. Let's take a look at our own objectives for this video session. Did we identify the first two features in the lesson preparation component? Did we differentiate between a content objective and a language objective? Let's take a look at our language objectives. Did we discuss content and language objectives that can be applied in the classroom? Did we read for examples of current content and language objectives? Okay, so let's move on to the last one. We're going to use features of WIDA and new academic standards to write content and language objectives that will be applied in the classroom. So should you differentiate language objectives based on your students' language proficiency? Although all teachers have students of varying language proficiency, it is not necessary to differentiate language objectives. Rather, teachers should have one language objective that is appropriate for all students to meet, and then provide different scaffolds such as adapted text, visuals, sentence frames for students to use in order to reach the objectives. For example, an appropriate language objective for an upper elementary language arts class might be for the students to be able to orally list text features found in a nonfiction book. For lower proficiency language learners, the teacher may give them a word bank from which to choose the text features, allowing these students to meet the same objective.
What I like about the Common Core is that it gives us very clear academic standards. It gives us the grade the academic standard is appropriate to and a clear skill, such as, for example, 4.0a.42. Recognize that a whole number is a multiple of each of its factors. Or the next one, determine whether a given whole number in the range 1 to 100 is a multiple of a given one-digit number. These are very clear skills that can be taught and assessed. As a quick review, let's see how we would develop a content objective and a language objective for a particular lesson. First of all, look at the content objective. Directly from the Common Core standard, it says 4.0a.44 says determine whether a given number in the range 1 to 100 is prime or composite. First thing you do is change it into a student-friendly format. I will be able to decide whether a number between 1 to 100 is prime or composite. The next step is to develop language objectives for the content objectives. So the children will be able to decide whether a number between 1 and 100 is prime or composite. But how are they going to do that? So this is where the language objectives come in. So you break it down, remembering that there are 4 components or 4 domains to language. So I will listen to the teacher's lesson and instructions. I will define what is a prime and composite number and discuss it with my group. I will read the directions for the activity and look at the examples given in the book and/or handout. And finally, I will complete a chart listing the prime and composite numbers with my group. So the language objectives address the listening, speaking, reading, and writing domains. So now that you've got your content objective and your language objective all written out, let's look at some tips before you start your lesson. Think about alternative materials. You can use as many materials needed to make the content comprehensible. Give pictorial support with pictures and videos. Don't settle for blackline masters. Find authentic materials. Use regalia, which are real-life representations of the things that you're talking about. If possible or necessary, allow L1 students to read curriculum content in their own language. Let the students create their own classroom materials. Use hands-on activities. Use poetry, music to reinforce key points about the content concepts. So before you start your lesson, these are the things that you need to have. You need to have a content objective. You need to have your language objectives, appropriate content concepts, supplementary materials if they're needed. You need to have adapted your content for different levels of proficiency, and you need to have meaningful activities that integrate lesson concepts.